All right. This month, we are talking about when you're developing a project, whether it be middle housing or not, you want to protect yourself from all the risks that are in your control. There's always going to be risks that are out of your control, and you can't control any of those things. But whatever is within your control, you want to be able to protect and manage the best you can to be able to limit any kind of losses or downside risk and make sure you have the highest opportunity for upside potential. So, this is a very dry type of discussion, but it's a very important one when it is related to developing, building homes, whether it be for yourself personally, whether it be for investment purposes, whether it be for sale, for rent, all of it. It doesn't matter. You want to make sure you're protecting yourself, just like you get home insurance for your house when you live in it, renter's insurance if you're renting it yourself, car insurance if you're driving your car, health insurance for yourself if you're you want to make sure that you can go to the doctor. This is just another type of insurance. But we're not only talking about insurance here, we're talking about the risks of the product type that people like, the what the market demands are, the cost of things, working with the right team, uh, what cost as it relates to interest and time on market or time in construction. And time is money when it comes to this. So there's a lot of different types of things that we'll talk about here today, but hang in there with me. So over the last 9 months, we've talked about all different types of things as it relates to middle housing, but it could really be used for any type of home development of any kind of type. And so this month, we're talking about risk and liability in development. Just as a quick recap, we're talking a lot about middle housing. And what is middle housing? It's an infill type of development where you could have a smaller lot within the city limits, which is, let's call it, 10,000, 20,000, half an acre to an acre. And you're putting, what was a one home on that lot could now be 4, 5, 6 or more homes on that lot, and building a product type that's desirable, whether it be for rent, for sale. That's just, there's a lot of different types technically in the code that have allowed for multiple different home types to be built on these lots based on the new codes that have passed. So the one in Washington State is House Bill 1110. These are all different types that you could build on your lot now: duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, courtyard apartments, stacked flats, townhomes, cottages. In my experience, the type of product that is the most desirable is a cottage style type home, because it's just really a suburban style home. But if you're in the urban core with potentially views of something super walkable downtown, what you can see here is a triplex, a fourplex, a sixplex, a townhome. They all are pretty much the same thing if you look at it really. But that's per definition what the state has allowed. House Bill 1337 is basically saying you could add accessory dwelling units to a piece of property in association with a primary dwelling unit. And, that could be a combination of a few different things: attached, detached, it could be above a garage, it could be down in a basement. Some of these can be segregated off and sold separately. Some of those could be for rent. Just, more options, trying to create more types of housing. One of the most important things that the state has done, and a lot of the nations are doing, or nation, I guess, is the surrounding states, is that they've updated a lot of the zoning codes, but they don't necessarily look at the public works or the building codes, the fire, the parking, the tree code. These infill development in general is complicated. There's a lot of factors that go into what makes it tick, what makes it make sense, what doesn't. But the zoning that's changed is really one factor to, one piece of the pie, if you will. If you'd like to learn more about all the other previous topics that we've had, as a part of our discussions, then you can take a look at our YouTube video. These have been recorded. They're uploaded. You can go back and look at the prior months and, watch these in your own time. So projects don't fail because risks exist. They fail because risks are not underestimated, they're ignored, or they're poorly managed. So everything comes with risk. It's just mitigating it and managing it is one of the most important things. The objective here is to talk about, development risk. Exactly what does that mean? And so there's risk from insurance, financing, construction defects. Remember, if you're building something to sell, you have a warranty period for 1 year, or you have a statute of repose where it could be up to 6 years. And so if you're building something for sale, you want to build a good quality product that doesn't keep you coming back having to fix a bunch of different things. And so the risk can not only be just during the build or during the sale, but also after you've totally disposed of the property, whether it be for sale, for rent, or whatever. You want to build a good quality product so you're not coming back multiple times. Common risks are financial and legal implications, mitigation strategies and best practices. I'm going to give you some real world examples of development projects that I've been a part of, or I know other people have been a part of, and what those risks were, and some of the decisions that you should be thinking about or kind of considering along the way. Risk management, why it matters. Well, let's think about it. Time is money, and there are things that are in your control, and then there are things that are out of your control. Anything that is in your control, you should try and manage and mitigate the risks as much as possible. And the things out of your control, you shouldn't try and focus on too much because they're out of your control, right? But what is in your control is managing the contractor or the contractor themselves, being efficient with your workflow, making sure that you have the proper insurance in place, making sure that you have lien releases for all of your subcontractors and suppliers, and making sure that you have the right capital stack when it comes to your financing in place to make sure that you're factoring in not only the time to be able to get your entitlements and build up the product, but also to sell off the homes. There's a lot that kind of goes into the whole thing. So risk is managed, and how risk management creates value. So protecting the capital, obviously, if you're doing this for investment purposes, you want to try and get the highest return as possible in the shortest amount of time, right? And you want to preserve that profitability, and you want to reduce your legal liability. So having the entity that you're building in be in an LLC, let's say you're doing this for investment purposes, that's going to limit personal liability and keep things shielded from outside risks as much as possible. Improving your financing outcomes by making sure that you've factored in enough time to be able to carry the project for the proper time that it's going to take to build, and also that you have a proper preliminary budget in place to make sure that you're not having to then inject more capital into the deal because you underestimated your cost and then it got more expensive over time, and then your loan to value, loan to cost ratios are all messed up. Obviously, you want to make sure you're protecting your reputation and putting out a good product. Not only for the buyers or the renters, but also for the rest of the industry, because if you have brokers, they want to know that they're selling a product that is a good quality product that's going to be well represented by the rest of the industry rather than shied away from as they're bringing their clients through. And then defects, obviously you want to work with good quality contractors, subcontractors, people that are doing things properly, to make sure that you're not going to be in a position of risk when it comes to defects or potential warranty items that come up down the road. This is a really good note. So the most successful developments are not those that avoid risk. They are the ones that identify it early, manage it effectively, and prevent it from becoming a crisis. One thing that one of my mentors really said when you're looking at projects, whether you want to move forward or not, kind of more of a feasibility type stage, is a 3-strike rule. So if you're identifying what the risks are, it could be for a lot of different types of projects, but like don't always be looking at things through rose-colored glasses. What are the upsides? What are the downsides? What are the pitfalls of this deal? And really poking holes in those pitfalls, and then how can you make sure you mitigate or work around those? So for example, like you want to make sure that access is good, parking is good. You're building a quality product that's going to fit within the neighborhood, not stand out too much. And, some of these things are risks that could shuffle out later on down the road. Every stage, new risks emerge, capital exposure increases, and decisions become more expensive. So early stage, low capital risk is like high uncertainty. So, I think this really comes down to making sure you're doing a good feasibility. We have had people come to us and they bought a piece of property because they said it felt like a good deal, but they don't really look at anything. They don't do a pre-submittal conference with the city. maybe like a formal pre-submittal conference, meaning that like they submitted a packet, they had the city formally review it, the fire marshal looked at it, the land use planner looked at it, the right-of-way public works looked at it, and they basically provided notes of what works and what doesn't work when you're planning to build something on this lot. So that is early stage risk. So making sure that you're getting a good architect in place, you're getting a good civil engineer in place, making sure that you're doing a formal meeting with the city or the county or the jurisdiction to limit the unknowns as you get through the early stages of that deal. That's how you mitigate a lot of your early risk. That way, as you then move forward into this new project that you're starting breaking ground on or putting a submittal packet together for, you've already identified those risks early on before you spent a significant amount of time and money. And those have come up as a part of the pre-submittal conference that you've had and all the due diligence that you did. So that is, that high uncertainty could be limited and go to much lower by doing some good early homework up front. The higher capital at risk is lower flexibility at later stages. You're already in the deal, you're already building out the project, you're almost all the way through, and the things out of your control, you have lower flexibility over, and you can't pivot as much because you've already set the permits, you've set your financing, you're on the path to build out this project, and it's really tough to kind of steer a big ship, if you will. So this is kind of a typical, really high level life cycle. However, prior to the acquisition or the acquiring, you're going to do your feasibility. So really above here, you should have initial look, feasibility, acquire, entitle, meaning getting permits, ready to build. You're going to design it with your, like while you're entitling it, you're also designing it, not only for the architecture, but also like what kind of cabinets, what kind of countertops, what kind of tile and paint and roofing and windows and doors and flooring and all of that, because that goes back to the budget that you have set for what you're planning to build, and making sure that what you're designing is in line with your budget is going to be really important as well. That's another way to mitigate some risk. Then after you get done with your entitlements and your design, getting ready for financing, making sure that your pro forma is really set up properly, and then you're building out the project after you get your financing, and then delivering it, whether it be for sale, pre-sales while you're building it, or you're renting it up. Either way. And then after you kind of sell off the full project or you rent it up fully and you stabilize it, then you're exiting. Managing risk at every stage, right? So acquisition risk, again, there should be a feasibility risk up here. You should really be asking yourself that question prior to the acquisition. Did we buy the right property? You shouldn't be asking that question after the fact. You should know that because you did your feasibility up front and you've brought in all of your consultants, maybe a land use attorney, and you've done your homework to be able to mitigate your risk there, right? And during that, you will have asked yourself while you're meeting with the city or the county or the jurisdiction and you're talking with your consultant team, can we actually build what we planned? How much is that going to cost? Is there any kind of sewer main extension? Do we need to put in a big storm vault? Can we get water to this site? Is water available? Those are things that definitely come up, like especially in Arizona or Eastern Washington. Is water available? Is a big one. Whoop. Did we design the project correctly? Like, I always like to look at what's your exit strategy. Are you planning to rent these? Are you planning to sell them? Or is it a combo of the two? Because, you can really cram a few more units in there and just have all surface parking if you plan to rent them. But if you're planning to sell them, it's a very different story, right? Financing risk, do we have enough capital? Always making sure, in my opinion, that you're overestimating your costs and hopefully coming in below. And that way I always like to under promise and over deliver, meaning that like you're gonna be more conservative on your cost, and so hopefully you then end up landing around here versus you're going to be really tight on your costs and then you end up coming in up here, right? Then your profit gets whittled away, your financing gets all messed up, you might have to inject some more cash and you don't want to do that. So just being a little bit more conservative is always good, which means you might not get every deal too. Managing risk at every stage, part 2. So construction risk, can we build it in the time that we're looking for? Um, uh, how long is it going to take to be able to build out this project? How long, what kind of, construction defects and liability risk? Will the building perform as intended? Meaning like, different states, different climates, there's going to be different types of energy codes and weather barriers. And, sometimes you're in a hotter climate and you're in a colder climate and you want to mitigate mold. You need a lot of airflow through there, like those are kinds of things that you need to make sure construction defects don't come up. And so that's a risk, right? You want to make sure that you're doing the proper lapping on your weather barrier and your flashings over your windows and all that stuff. Market risks, will the buyers or tenants show up? If you're building a product, it's not a if you build it they will come. This is a proven product. We've seen it stabilize, we've seen it sell, and it's a known. That way you're eliminating that risk. So, really getting in tune with what people are buying, staying close to the ground with, keeping your ear to the ground, I guess, of what the industry is saying, talking with people that are in the industry, really making sure that you're building a product that's going to get absorbed well. And then if you do all of that, then you should be able to achieve your investment objectives as long as all of those things are within your control and you're doing a good job and you're asking yourself these questions along the way. So why do projects fail? Most projects fail because they're not caused by a single event, but a series of unmanaged risks, right? So let's just say you weren't very thoughtful on your budget. You didn't do a good feasibility. You didn't know there was a storm main extension. You didn't know the neighborhood community was going to come together and decide they want to sue you over your project. You didn't know that, the inner office politics of the city's review is going to take longer than expected. So there's a lot of different things that you can manage, and there's a lot of things that you can't manage. But this is why I always like to be a little bit more conservative. Assume the project is going to cost a little bit more. Assume it's going to take a little bit longer. And if you end up doing it quicker and you end up doing it for a project for less, your deal looks better. And so managing those risks is super important. This is a lot of things. So top 10 causes of project failure. So you don't do your due diligence. You buy a deal because it feels like a good deal. You didn't check to see if you had water availability to the lot. You didn't know there was a storm main extension that needed to get done. Those are a lot of the things people don't look at during due diligence. So making sure you're looking at things properly. You're not estimating costs properly. So number 2, your poor financial feasibility. So you're not estimating costs properly. Maybe you're just throwing a lump sum price per square foot in there, but you're not factoring in all the little nuances. Like you got to be a little more thoughtful on your estimating during feasibility. Also, if there's any affordable housing fees or impact fees or, connection fees for your sewer, your storm, your water, or anything like that. Choosing the right team. Don't bring over an architect from a different state that's never worked in that jurisdiction before because they don't have the relationships, they don't know the code, and so you may be paying for them to learn along the way. Unless you're building like a super high-end, custom, one-of-a-kind, GOAT-style project, you're going to want to work with somebody who has a proven track record working in that area that, knows what they're doing and has the right relationships. And so if we're ever working in an area that we've never worked in before, we're choosing the right team members that have had experiences working in that city or jurisdiction and know those team members at the city because they have relationships and they've been there for a while. Cost escalations. So like during COVID, lumber went up like 300% and concrete went up. I don't even know what the percentage was. I want to say it was like 50%. This is the reason why I like to be a little bit higher on our construction budgets and make sure that we are not coming in so super tight and close to where, our budget actually is, but overestimating because there's some, things out of your control. Like you can't control what lumber prices are, but you can control what your budget is. So, cost escalations, permitting and entitlement delays. So, always making sure you're factoring in extra time. Sometimes the city or design review board, may delay things. You're going to have somebody that's appealing your project. These are things that you don't really have control over, but you want to factor in. your timelines to be able to get through that entitlement period. Financing challenges, that could be a whole line item in itself, but I think really setting up your construction budget, estimating your interest rates timeline, not only just to build it, but also to sell through it, is super important. And then maybe factoring in some extra interest rates. So for example, if you're like doing a construction loan and you're at like 2 points and 10%, if you're using a private money lender or a hard money lender, maybe factor in like 2.5 points and 11%. Because if for whatever reason you got a floating rate and that goes up, you have some cushion there, right? Or maybe in your financial feasibility, you're at 2 and 10, but you ended up getting the rate at 1 and 9. You just made extra money because but I would keep that line item in that budget, where it is, so that way you can have that extra cost. If you get it for a lower price, great, you made some extra money. But let's keep it in there and not make sure we're screwing ourselves. Construction defects, we kind of talked about that a little bit, using good quality contractors and means and methods to, limit any future warranty issues. Poor risk management, that would be just not thinking about any of these things. These are all risks, so not managing them. Market misjudgments, maybe building a product type that is the first of its kind, or building a product type that you haven't seen actually being built and sold in the market, and so you're the first of the first, and like hopefully you're going to make it, but it just isn't proven. Or there's things out of your control. I mean, like look at Washington. People are moving out of the state due to a lot of things going on here, between Seattle and the state just making some bad choices as regards to taxes, and that's factoring the reason why the market is where it's at potentially. Failure to know when to walk away. So sometimes you just got to make some tough decisions, and they always say don't throw good money after bad money. Hopefully you don't ever get there, but sometimes you just can't dig your way out, and you just got to cut your losses and run. Selecting the site, super important, not only for feasibility but also location, amenities, making sure that you're just not buying a deal because you think it's a deal, but making sure you're thinking about all the other things that come along with it when selecting a site. Environment risks, like it says here, market constraints, is it walkable to amenities? Is it in a good location? So are other people building around in that area? Do you see there's proof of concept? If there isn't, then there's probably a reason why. So, yeah. Feasibility analysis, evaluating whether a project is realistically capable of succeeding before significant capital is committed. That was kind of what I was talking about. You do your stress test, you get a lead, you take a look at it. How many units can fit here? What's the cost? What's the time? What's the risks? Does it make sense? Okay, let's tie it up, or let's go through a full feasibility. Let's do a pre-submittal conference. Let's talk with the city. Let's bring in our architect. Let's do a yield study. Let's look at, have our contractor give us some cost estimates, and really fully answer these questions to make sure you're limiting as much risk as possible. Vendor selection, yeah, definitely. I mean, like choosing the right contractor or consultant, as I mentioned about the architects and the engineers and the designers and people that are going to be working on the projects, having worked in that jurisdiction with proof that they've done a good job, they've done it in a timely manner, super important. Same thing with the contractor. If you're working with a contractor that's never built in that area before, or maybe they've never built that product type before, or maybe they've only done remodels, they never actually built anything ground up before. The lowest guy sometimes is the most expensive because of the headaches and the change orders and the delays that it takes. So making sure you're working with somebody who actually knows what they're doing. Having expertise in that product type and integrity also is super important. Yeah, as mentioned here, like, you use the wrong person, it's going to take longer to permit, it's going to cost you more time, you could miss the market. If you use the wrong contractor, it could cost you more in the long run. So, really vetting the people that you're working with. Oh yeah, I think the one other thing here is talking about is like litigation. You want to limit that as much as possible, right? Making sure you're working with the right people is one of the main reasons you can get out of that. All right. Yeah. So why does this all matter? There's I've said a lot and we're only halfway through our slides. So how long has this been so far? I mean, like 25 minutes. Jeez, it's gonna be a full hour and a half. Hopefully we can pare it down. But why does this all matter? Right? Well, you have a piece of property that you want to develop on, and you want to make sure that this number that you think you're going to get for your return is going to actually happen. And there's a long ways to be able to get from here to here. And so how can we mitigate that risk and hope that the outcome that we're expecting is going to happen? Um, you want to make sure that you've got a tight team that's working on your deadlines, making sure you don't miss those. You don't want to deliver poor quality of work. Working with a contractor that's getting multiple bids and getting final bids before you go to your construction lender and get your final bid. So that way, if you say you got this tile and you budgeted, let's just call it, I don't know, 60 grand for this tile or whatever in your budget. And then, okay, you're working through the project and now you're ready to pick out tile. Oh, let's pick out this one. And it ends up being 75 grand. No, you should, before you get your permits, be working on all of your specs. So that way, you know what you're putting in and where and how much it costs to make sure that your budget is in alignment with what you're actually going to buy. And there's no question. I'm not running around trying to figure out what I'm going to be putting in the house, because that's going to take more time. It's going to delay the project. And you don't know if that budget and that, the expectation of what you want to put in is real. You always just want to be dialed in. So, yeah, lack of sufficient staffing. You need to make sure that there's definitely adequate barriers of people managing. You don't want to have one guy that's spread too thin that's going to, not have oversight on the project, because things are not going to move as quickly or as efficiently as they should. And then the insurance that comes along with it. You got your builder's risk, you got your general liability, you've got, your pollution liability potentially, depending on the product type that you're working with. If you're bringing windows to a site that's going to be sitting there for a period of time, sometimes you need to insure that product before it gets installed, because sometimes things can walk away because somebody picks them up, puts them in their truck, and it walks away. So yeah, many things you should probably be thinking about as you're going through a project. Yeah, the cheapest bid trap. I hear this one comes up all the time. I always have people ask me like, well, what's your price per square foot? Like, how much is it going to cost me to build this project? And if you don't have a set of drawings, you don't have a set of engineered plans, and you haven't even taken a look at the deal, you don't know what the utilities look like, you don't know how much infrastructure you got to upgrade it, or if you do, it's just a loaded question. And sometimes people are asking people that are building in completely different areas and completely different product types, and they're trying to get a number. And maybe they didn't factor in sales tax, or they didn't factor in their fee, or they didn't factor in whatever it is. So it's just like making sure that the bid that you get is a quality, full encompassing bid that is conservative and includes everything. Your inclusions and your exclusions are really what is super important when you're looking at your contractor. Just like when you're getting an offer on a piece of property, it's not only price, but it's also terms. So it's in the construction world, it's sure your price to build, but also what's included and what's not included in that. That's a really important question to ask. Yeah, so here's an example that comes up with numerous different, consultants, if you will. I kind of mentioned this before, but working with experienced consultants is really important, because if you don't, you're going to have a lot of RFIs. What's an RFI? If you don't know what that is, it's called request for information. You got a plan, you have a question on a plan, it doesn't have design. Let's just say it's like a flashing detail around a window. You need to make sure you're doing it properly, because you got brick there, you got weather barrier, you've got your rain screen, and you need to make sure everything's done properly. Otherwise, you're going to have water intrusion. So like, if you don't have a detail for that, and for whatever reason you have to request an RFI, multiple RFIs create a lot of different time delays, to create scope gaps. Contractors say, oh, that wasn't included, it increased costs. Having an experienced team is super important. That kind of rolls down to design conflicts, which then creates change orders. And then sometimes these things have to go in for additional permit reviews, which create additional costs in relation to reviewing with the city staff and the cost that goes along with that when you submit and resubmit, just additional delays potentially. Yeah, this is just an example of, if you decide that you want to go with the lowest bidder as a contractor or as a developer, for example, you're hiring the lowest bidder that is the contractor. Let's just say there's like in this world, time is money, right? So you have a daily interest rate that you're accruing over time as you're building out a project. And if you have a contractor who is short-staffed, inexperienced, spread too thin, never built that product type before, doesn't have good relationships behind them with suppliers and subcontractors, their schedule could get longer and longer. They say they're going to do it in 12 months. It takes 13 months. It takes 14 months. And when you look at your project, you have a whole cash flow schedule. So like your interest is based off of the total loan that you've created, right? So when you basically fund a project with construction, you're starting a construction loan down here. And then as you build and you get your draw requests, your budget gets higher and higher because you're like originally it's just a budget. You're like, oh, I'm going to use these dollars to build out this house. And then as you actually draw on those dollars and your loan, volume gets higher and higher because you're actually spending that money. And a lot of times you can have interest accrue on interest reserves. So you're not having to pay it out of pocket until you actually, sell off the home or you fully stabilize it, rent it out, and then, turn it into a rental property or whatever. But the longer time that it takes to be able to execute the construction, the more money you're going to create in interest, which then creates, delays and lack of profit. So this is just kind of an example here of longer timelines, schedule slips, daily interest rate reserve increases will create additional costs to the project, which then lowers profit. So that's an additional risk you kind of have to think about. Yeah, evaluating a contractor. I can't say this more. This is choosing the right contractor is super, super, super important. Experience, qualifications, financial stability, capacity, safety record, insurance coverage, performance history. The list goes on and on and on and on. Verifying who you're working with has built this product type before. They've done, real estate development in the past. This is super important. These are some references. These are some things that you should be looking at as you're getting ready to hire your contractor, right? So do they have, what does a resume look like? Have they ever built, are they a remodeler that's going to build a big townhome site? Have they ever built anything like this before? Did they grow up in a family of doing this? Did they do it for a job? Like, do they have any references that you can send them that says that they had a good experience building out their project? Do they have a bunch of litigation history? These are all multiple things to look at when it comes to vetting and hiring a contractor. Entitlement risk, getting the approvals. What's an entitlement? Some people think that, children are entitled, but this is really more about like receiving the approvals to actually build the product that you would like to build. And so those are called your entitlements. And, let's just say you estimated it was going to take 6 months to be able to get permits, but it took you 12. Making sure that the architects, the civil engineers, the city staff, the estimate on your side and your financial, pro forma is estimating how long it's going to take to be able to get entitlements is within line rather than under what you're expecting. Yeah, just another risk when it comes to permitting delays, right? So sometimes, here's another thing that's out of your control. Sometimes a city or a jurisdiction is getting so many permits, they're inundated and they're understaffed and they're receiving so much and they just put a moratorium on building. What does that even mean? It means that they basically stopped accepting permits. They're going to stop it for 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is. because they need to catch up. They need to breathe. They need to hire some staff. They need to train them up. That's real. It doesn't happen super often, but it's a real risk. I wouldn't blow up all your performance because of it, but like, just not being too overly optimistic, making sure that the city staff can, you know, respond to reviews in a good, timely manner is super important. Coordination failures. Okay, yeah. So this one is really important. So like when you're ready, like, okay, you waive feasibility on a deal, you're ready to move forward, you kick off your architect, you kick off your civil engineer, you got your geotech going, you're doing infiltration testing, you got your arborist, you've got a phase one, whatever it is. All of these people are siloed into their own specific scopes, right? But really it's your job to bring them all together and make sure they're communicating, because this is a team sport and we're building this full project, and there's a lot of different hands in this pie, if you will, to make this full thing come together. And so if they're not talking to each other, if they're not coordinating between themselves, if you're not working together as a collective team, you're going to create more delays. And so making sure that you're not just letting people do whatever they want, but you're setting timelines on when people are supposed to get back to you with reviews. You're setting timelines on when they're supposed to get back to you with preliminary designs. You're setting timelines on when they're supposed to go to the structural engineer and when the structural engineer is supposed to get done. So that way you can shorten that entitlement submittal packet period to then be able to submit, rather than just letting them work off their own timelines. You need to have a schedule in line, and everyone's agreed to it. Yeah, we just kind of talked about this, right? So delays, time is money, interest payments will go up, property taxes happen every month, or they stack over the years, every 6 months, quarterly, whatever you want to do. Insurance, you got to factor in. Yeah, overhead expenses, things like that. This is one that you can't really control as much. You can in some cases, you can't in others. But the political and community risk of building a product type in a community that doesn't really want you to build there. That could be it potentially. They don't want you to build there, and so they're going to appeal the project. They're going to come together as a community and they want to sue you. This doesn't happen all the time, I would say, but it's something to be, having a line item in your budget for attorney review, or CC&R review or design review, and having attorney involved and responses to things it's always a good idea. Sometimes you just don't ever know what's going to happen, and it's just another thing that you have to factor in. So, sometimes people think that builders are making just a bunch of cheese, but they don't factor in all of the risk and the time that it takes to build it, and all the pushback and the lending and the insurance and the home buyers and the tail of after you sell it, the warranties. It's just it's a lot. And so that's, why the budgets are where they are. Yeah, environmental risk, definitely a big factor, especially when you're working on projects during the wet season. Sometimes you got to get a wet season grading permit. So that way, you've got your TESC, your temporary erosion sediment control. You can't just be digging in the dirt that just looks like soup and just let that mud flow down into your neighbor's property or into a native growth area like it's shown here. Or you need to protect certain areas as you're working around them, or after you're done with construction, you may have to set up sprinklers to be able to properly water those areas. There's just, things to think about. Every site is different. Every, lot has different risks. It's just something to think about. This is a crazy one. Over here in South Washington State area, kind of southwest, you've got the Mazama pocket gopher. That's an endangered species. And, they have habitats, and if you want to build on a big property and it's all wooded and there's a pocket gopher, you got to get a little study to make sure that you're not endangering their habitat, or if they are, what are you going to do to be able to make sure you're not killing them off or driving them away, or how are you going to mitigate that risk? This is a very unique one, but it's something that you just, depending on where you're developing, it's just something to consider. Kind of interesting though. Yeah, we kind of talked about this earlier, cost escalation risks, right? Things that are out of your control. Lumber went up 300% during COVID. Uh, Concrete went up, so making sure that you've got some fluctuation in your budget. That's what your contingency's for. I always like to aim on the higher side of the contingency, because really what a contingency is the unknowns, right? Like a contingency plan is meaning that you're factoring in costs for the unknown. And so if you've bought out your budget, you've got a little extra room in those, and you've got contingency there. Hopefully you don't have to use all your contingency. If you don't, that just all goes back down to the bottom line, meaning it's more profit. But those are, those line items are for the unknowns, and, absorbing those costs for things that come up that you can't factor in. Just those are the things that you just don't know. Yeah, here's kind of just a little bit more about the lumber prices and the fluctuations of those. And this is one of those things you can't control. Interest rate risks. This is what I was talking about earlier, making sure that you're factoring in a higher interest reserve in your pro forma than what you're actually getting. So that way, if you float up, you have some extra cushion in your deal to factor in higher rates if they end up going up. This is just talking about how, where rates were at one point in time, where they ended up going to, and how that could dramatically affect the profitability of a project based off the hikes in interest rates as you're building a project. And once you start building a project, your foundations are in, your lumber is getting dropped off, and it's the interest rates are changing while you're doing all of that. Like, you don't really want to stop, but at the same time, you want to make sure that it still financially makes sense, right? So it's just something to think about. Yeah, this is just kind of showing the historical construction loan interest over time, right? Wow, that's pretty high. Like, look at that, 1983. You're like 18%. Crazy. Capital stack risk. There's a lot of different, I think I might have talked about this on a different month, but just investment capital, how the capital stack comes together. You have a lot of different financial, what should I say? You got a lot of different financial things to consider as a part of the equation. So not only do you have your interest rate, you could have a land loan prior to your construction loan, or you got a bridge loan, or you've got a construction loan, or maybe you have a loan for your second position, which is your equity. That could be, as that equity could be coming in as mezz debt, which is a second deed of trust potentially. You could have cash being injected, which is basically syndicated, and they get part ownership of the LLC. So there's just a lot of different ways that you're making sure that, like, capital always goes where it's treated best. So treating your capital well is really, really important. Yeah, cash flow risk. Project runs out of available cash. I think this is the reason why, like, you just got to be more conservative than super aggressive, because if you're conservative on your interest, you're conservative on your construction budget, you're conservative on how long it's going to take to be able to get your permits. It's a fine balance. You don't want to just crush every deal because you're overestimating everything, but you also don't want to be too optimistic to where you run over your budget on your interest or your construction or anything else like that. So cash flow, meaning, your total return, or how long it's going to take to be able to stabilize that product, and or what the total costs are for that project. Because if you come in at a higher cost, your cash flow goes down when you stabilize it down the road, whether that be a for sale or for rent product. Either way, So why does all of this really matter? Projects require a lot of cash, and that happens really before you start putting a shovel in the ground. During your feasibility, which is prior to the acquisition, you're going to have some cash available to be able to pay for some of these studies, to be able to also meet with the city, and they need to get paid for their time. And so, you're going to need some liquidity for that. Then purchasing the property. you're going to need liquidity for that, or maybe you got investors, or maybe you're going to get a loan, but it's going to be a combo of investment capital and a loan. You're going to need cash, or you're going to need a budget in your loan for the entitlements. So paying for your architect and your civil engineer and your structural and your permit fees and your MHA fees or whatever, your designer, you're going to need, cash for that. Designing and engineering, permits, construction, we kind of talked about that. You're obviously going to need to get a loan for construction. I don't know anyone who's building everything out of cash, because that's just not using your leverage properly, but it does mitigate a lot of risk. You're going to have to make payments on those loans. Depending on how your capital is set up, you're not having to cut a check every month out of your pocket for those loans for that construction. It just is a line item in your budget, and you have interest reserves, meaning that you've reserved a sum of money aside for interest, and the lender is going to give you the loan, and then basically it's just going to stack up. And then once you stabilize it for rents, you'll roll into a different loan product and you'll pay off that construction lender, and the interest reserves will get paid back with it as a part of the total loan payback. Or you'll sell off that house, and that sale will then pay back all those interest reserves as well. So you can kind of think about it like a budget for your tile, if you will, right? Like you're going to budget $75,000 for your tile, and you pay it along the way, but you don't actually have to pay for all the tile until you sell it off. Kind of for an example, I guess. Operating expenses, you got to make sure people are getting paid along the way as they're building out a project, whether that be the operator, the builder, whatever. Like there's costs that go involved. Nobody's working for free. Your sensitivity analysis. So this is called a stress test. So don't always be looking at your project through rose-colored glasses. Always be looking at, again, like where's the pitfalls? What if costs go up? What if sales go down? What if it takes longer on the project? Really stress testing, like worst case scenario, is really important to make sure that the juice is worth the squeeze on that deal. Yeah, this is saying exactly what I was saying. Being conservative on your costs, reducing financial risk, improving your budget accuracy. Yeah, the Liberty investments, this is what we do, right? Like this is the reason why I'm so passionate about this, because so many people have come to me and been like, hey, I got this property I want to develop, or I don't know how to do this, or hey, I got this client that wants to do this, and it's all risk mitigation. That's all it is. It's just having a prior proper steps. What is it? What is that acronym? Well, there's so many of them when I was in the trades. It's like work your plan, plan your work. Or plan your work your plan, I think is what it was. And then prior proper steps prevents. I can't remember what that one is. I'll have to find out what that one is. That's a good one. Insurance coverage, I kind of already talked about this. Builder's risk, that's just exactly what it is. It's insurance policy for the property owner against, construction, which is a riskier type of loan, making sure that, let's say the house gets burnt down, or an earthquake happens, or, you get like a 1 in 100 year water event, like it rains and it just runs through the house while you're framing it up, and you get some water damage. Or somebody that I know had snow. It was a huge winter that had a lot of snow, and it basically then it created ice, and it froze, and they were in framing, and then it basically created mold. And this is the reason why you have the risk, the builder's risk insurance. And then you got general liability for the contractor, and then pollution liability depending on where you're building and the product types maybe that you may be putting on the site, or things like that. That's super important as well. Yeah, this kind of goes back to managing the right builder, hiring the right team, having good contracts. Your risk is also factored into the contract. So having a good tight contract that kind of thinks through a lot of different options and scenarios to protect yourself from any potential liability in the future. Having third-party inspections, depending on the type of project that you're doing. the scale at which you're doing it. You may have third-party inspections to be able to provide reports that you'll save and use for future use if you need it for any kind of litigation that you may future have. Yeah, and then carrying the appropriate insurance. Professional liability insurance you're going to want to have for all of your different engineers and architects because they're licensed professionals, and you want to make sure that you have risk in that regard. Let's just say, for example, your structural engineer designs something, you build it per plan, and then some thing happens, a wall falls, a ceiling falls, whatever it is. They need to have insurance to be able to factor in, like, why did that happen or whatever. They need to be held responsible, and there's a reason for that insurance as well. This is the 6-year Washington statute, which goes after substantial completion. So, you may be building and selling a home and the builder's giving a 1-year warranty, or maybe they're giving a 2-year warranty, but really the builder's on the hook for 6 years based off of the statute of repose, which is for structural defects, water intrusion, life safety, building envelope failures, things of that nature. So building a good product, building a good quality product, making sure you're working with good subcontractors is really important because you're really on the hook for 6 years. And you could be selling off a project and 3 years later, all of a sudden you have all these claims and you built a 50-unit deal and you're like, oh my gosh, this is why it's important to manage your risk here. Yeah, litigation trends, making sure that you're working with good, kind of goes back again to your contractors, your developers, your architects. The product type that you're delivering to the neighborhood meets the desirability of what people want, and trying to eliminate any future litigation. This is just talking about condos. Like, this was kind of more like high-rise style condos, apartment style condos that were built for sale back in the day. There was a big stretch after there was the Wakaiwa came out, and they kind of, the condo liability reform. Basically, it's created a lot more risks for builders and developers building condo projects, high-rise stuff, because of weather barrier, water intrusion, things of that nature. So there's a big gap in the condos for that reason. The smaller condo projects have less risk just due to the scale of them, but still something that should be mitigated and kind of managed and watched over time, and also while you're building. This is just kind of talking again about the period of time in which a lot of these condo projects were getting built, the high-rise ones I was telling you about, the defects, the water failures, the flashing, the drainage, things like that. They led to litigation. The Washington Condominium Act provided, warranties for purchasers, things like that. This is talking about suits from developers, building out condo projects, and a lot of attorneys were going after big high-rise style condos because they were looking for defects, and then those defects would be arose, and then they would go and talk with the HOAs, and then they would create a lawsuit against the developer. And then there's been a law that's passed called right to suit, I believe. Here we go. This is called the statute that gives builders a second chance. So basically, this RCW passed, which is a right to cure. So if some defect happens, they should have the opportunity to be able to cure it and fix it at their cost. And it was something that was resulted in a defect. And rather than just going and suing them, you should be able to bring it to their attention, allow them to fix it. Again, this is for large, super big projects, but this is the reason why a lot of condo projects have slowed down due to that effect. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, right to cure. This is what I was talking about, making sure that the lawsuits stop before they start, right? This is all goes back to making sure you're working with a good weather barrier consultant, whether you're working with a good contractor or somebody who's built that product type before, an architect who's designed that product type, you know, taking pictures, daily logs, good contracts are in place between your general construction and your subcontractors and your suppliers and your material providers and all these other things. So yeah, market risk. This is a lot of stuff that you can't control. Obviously, if you're building a product in a growing area while jobs are increasing and people are moving here, that's good market and things are going up and the economic shifts are in your favor and a rising tide will raise all ships. However, you also want to plan for the downside. So don't always be looking at the highest comp and pricing it around there. Look at the lower or the middle end comp and make sure that you're being conservative on your sales prices to, try and not be too optimistic when it comes to the market. Sometimes the market can be shifting underneath of you and, you're in the middle of construction. But as long as you're being conservative on everything along the way, most likely you're going to be okay. But it's just another risk that you need to factor in as a part of your total capital stack in the project. Oh, whoops. Sorry, backwards. Yeah, the additional risks that come up, change order management, making sure that like if you are getting ready to start a project as it's being designed before you start construction or get your budget funded, going through the design, getting your spec, hard bidding that out, making sure that the product type that you've bid or designed to be included as your project is actually available with the supply chains, having a tight schedule and not just letting it run on forever. Broker liability, this is a big one, making sure that you're working with a broker that understands how to sell the product type or specializes in new construction, because it's very different than a resale type of house. The warranties, the builder addendums, the easements, the parking, there's a lot that goes into selling new construction and being able to create confidence with buyers and their brokers to instill confidence enough to be able to write an offer is super important. So that's a big one. And then the exit risk, just getting through the deal, whether that be leasing it up or selling it out. Yeah, so sophisticated developers don't ask, can we make money? They ask, can we make enough money to justify the risk? Yeah, so sometimes let's just say, for example, you look at a small deal and you're like, oh, I'm getting a 15% return on this deal or a 20% margin or whatever, but it's like a super small deal and you're making like 100 grand, 150 grand or whatever. And you're like, man, it's going to take me like a year and a half to be able to get out of this deal. Is that even worth 150 grand? Is that risk in that time? Is there enough juice to squeeze? Yeah, sure, like it financially, like percentage wise makes sense, but is it worth doing? It's the question, right? And so it's not necessarily about can we make money. It's just like is the risk worth the money that you're going to make, and is the proper margin in place, and are you conservative enough to be able to hopefully carve out some of those costs and get there, but you still are making a good margin anyways. Not every project should get built, but some of the best development decisions are ones that you don't move forward with because they're too risky, they cost too much, there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of reasons why you should not move forward with a deal. But the ones that you do, mitigating the risk as much as possible. Successful project or a less expensive lesson. Yeah. Risk management can mean the difference between a successful project and an expensive lesson. That is very true. All right, so final takeaways. We are at just about an hour here. The most successful developments don't avoid risk; they manage it better, and they than their competitors. So, what does that mean? Every development involves risk, as we have mentioned, and the objective is to identify it and make sure that you're managing it, you're evaluating it, and you're creating barriers around that risk. What is in our control and what is not within our control, and how are we managing and mitigating that risk to the best of our capabilities. Um, the wrong team can really destroy a deal, that's for sure. So making sure you're hiring the right, owner's rep, general contractor, development partner, architects, engineers, those that's super important. And then if the deal doesn't pencil, walk away. Don't get emotionally attached to the deal and just try and force it to work, because you can make a pro forma tell you anything that you want. Doesn't mean that you should do that deal. So yeah, so this is our approach at Liberty Investments. So we identify the risks early, evaluate them objectively, and manage and make disciplined decisions before we commit a significant amount of capital. So we don't chase projects. We like different properties. Sure, we have our eye on something that looks like something that we want to move forward with, but we're not just being overly aggressive just to do a deal to do a deal. We want to make sure that it makes sense, that we're managing our risks, that we're being thoughtful about our capital partners with our investors, and we are creating a sound plan and schedule to execute, because at the end of the day, we're not doing it for fun. Yeah, so why would you work with Liberty Investments? Who are we and what do we do? We understand, if you look at our website, you can really see all the different projects that we've worked on, the different projects that we've built, all different types, different areas, from multifamily to smaller infill to customs, and also understanding how to work through the cities and counties and navigate the city staff and the entitlements, and how to work with the team collectively to create the submittal packets that's going to be most likely accepted and not significantly delay or create a lot of redesigns, which then creates more time and more money. And so what does that mean? We maximize lands and identify the highest and best use of properties. And we also align that with individual goals. So we always look at like, okay, we have this piece of property, or we have a client that has this piece of property, and what is their goal? Are they wanting to build to rent? Are they building to sell? Are they wanting to do a combo of the two? How can we make sure we're making that the most profitable with the least amount of risk, and do it in the quickest amount of time to be able to execute the goal of the client or for ourselves? Yeah, we have an internal brokerage, and so we have a lot of real estate experience between acquisitions, entitlements, and development, specifically around new construction, multi-unit, infill development, multifamily, and we have a very in-depth knowledge of the area, the product type, and what the market really wants. How do we deliver clear results? Create a clear scope for the project before it begins. Create results-driven scheduling, budgeting, contingency planning. We coordinate between all the architects, the engineers, the city staff, the builders, the contractor, the subcontractors. We lock in material pricing early, so before we get our construction funded, we know what the budget's going to be, because we already have all the specs spec'd out, and we know what product type is going in where. So then we can go to our suppliers and subcontractors to make sure that's locked in, so we have less fluctuation in pricing. And we prevent expensive rework in that regard, because we're not changing things along the way, or we're not picking things out as we're going. And to do that, that really helps manage our timelines. It reduces delays and maximizes profit, because we're putting a plan in place and we're working that plan, and we're not figuring it out as we go. If you have a piece of property and you really want to understand what can yield there, how many units you can fit, what's desirable, how long it's going to take, what it's going to cost, really that's a pre-feasibility. That is kind of like more like the initial look before you do a full feasibility. This is kind of like a look before you leap kind of thing. It just really kind of solidifies, like, is this worth pursuing? Should we start looking at this before we start spending any money with a pre-submittal conference with the city, or hire an architect, or do any kind of survey or any of that kind of stuff? Like, does it make sense? Does it pencil? Is it a good lot? Was access good? Things like that. This is what's included in your pre-feasibility. We have more information on our website. If you want to go to our website, it's www.liberty-investments.com. That will be also on the screen here for you to scan, and you can go to here shortly. But this is a lot of the stuff that's included prior to us even spending a significant amount of time, but we look at a lot of stuff. Um, who benefits from this? We've got land use attorneys working with property owners, architects working with clients that don't get clear direction. Lenders are working with property owners who have a want and desire to redevelop their property because now they can fit more homes on their lot, but they've never developed anything before and they won't give them the loan because of the risks. So they're coming to us because we're a good partner to work with them to execute the project. Real estate brokers, they've got clients who have property that want to either redevelop or they want to understand the value of their property now with this new yields or density they can put on their lot. Private wealth advisors are advising property or people and their full portfolio as it relates to not only their stock portfolios, but their real estate. And so they benefit from it. Private wealth advisors, property owners, obviously, they've now heard that they can put more homes on their property than they could before, and that means more dollars for them. So what does that mean? How long is it going to take? What's the risk? What's the time? What's the potential returns? Estate attorneys, same thing. They as the land use attorneys, real estate investors, somebody has a want and desire to buy a piece of property and build and develop. Maybe they're from out of state. Maybe they've bought a bunch of rental properties over time and they now see that they can fit more homes on their lot, but they've never developed before. So these are just a lot of different types of people that have been reaching out. We've also been working with them in various different capacities. After you go through the pre-feasibility and we kind of take a look at, the highest and best use, the cost, the time, the risk, is it worth moving forward? Then here's kind of what the project timeline would look like. You have a piece of property. We have an initial call. We have a pre-feasibility. We go through the full feasibility, meaning that we start spending a significant amount of more time having the pre-submittal conference. If everything's a go after that, we kick off the project with our design team, start putting the submittal packet together. You follow along. You got the designer that gets involved. What are we putting in the house? Paint, colors, tile, flooring, roofing, everything. Spec that out. Then after you have all that, you buy out the project. And then once your permits are issued, you go to financing, you build it, you sell it, or you rent it. So this is kind of just a very generic step-by-step workflow process on how we work and how we operate. This is dumbed down to make sure that it's in bite-sized pieces for people to understand. And then if you have a piece of property and you're interested in learning more, you can scan the QR code here and it'll bring it to our website and where we can get started and kind of help you start looking at what potential you have on your property, what the returns could look like, and how we can work together along the way. With that, appreciate you watching us on YouTube. Thanks for taking the time to tune in. If you thought this content was helpful, make sure you hit the like button, share it if you thought maybe somebody else could learn from this. Subscribe to our channel as we post more videos. You could be aware, and we really hope that you have received a lot of value from this, because at the end of the day, the reason why we're putting this content out is because we want to make sure that people are making sound decisions. There are risks involved, but we want to make sure that people, are making decisions knowing the full risk and not just a hope, a wish, a dream, and a prayer. And so with that said, appreciate you for tuning in, and we'll talk to you later.